Hello everyone, today I want to talk about the hashCode and the equals method of the java.lang.object class. So both of these methods are very important if you intend to store your objects in any of the collection classes that Java provides. The hashCode function is used for hashMap or hashSet, and the equals method is used for hashMap, hashSet, ArrayList, linked list, whenever you need to compare objects. So let's take a look with the following example. I create a class called book, and I add a few properties here. One is the property author, and I add another property of type string called title. And then I add a price to it of type integer, so the price is in cents, so we don't run into any floating point issues. So these are my three properties. Let me add some getter and setter methods for these. There's a getter and setter for the author. I add a getter and setter for the title, and one more for the price. So to fully understand why we need them, let's create a main class with a main method. And let's create a couple of book objects. So we have book 1, and for that book 1 we set the author, John, and we set a title, fun facts, and then I create another book with the exact same properties. And this one I call book 2. I set the author and I set the title of book 2. Now let's say we have let's say we want to compare these objects. If we do book 1 dot equals book 2, and we output both are equal, and if they're not equal, we output not equal. Now let's run this. So this one says they are not equal, but if we look at the properties, they're exactly the same. So essentially it's the same book, it's just a different object. The reason is that by default the equals method uses a reference and it compares the reference. So if I compare book 1 to book 1, that is the same reference. This is equal. Or if I have a book 3 and I assign book 1 to it, so this will essentially store a reference to the book 1 object, and I compare these two, these will also be equal. So the same purpose gets used, or the same idea gets used whenever we use a list. So let's say we use an array list of books. And now let's add our books to it. We have book 1 and we add book 2. And we now want to check if our book exists. So we do list.contains and we do book 2. And actually let's remove book. Let's just add book 1 to it. Now we want to check if book 2 it exists in our list. So we don't care about the object in this case. We really care about the properties. Does our list contain an object of type book where the author is John and the fun facts and the title is fun facts? Now if I output this, and I run my program, this will say false, it doesn't exist. So here what we really need to do is we need to override the equals method. So let's go back to our book class and we override the equals method here. So equals, we always compare to another object, and the object is of type object. And the first thing that we want to do is we check the reference. Is it the exact same object as this one? We don't need to compare anything. It points to the same memory location, so we can return true. Otherwise, let's check if the object is actually an instance of the book class. And if not, we can return it cannot be the same book. So we use the instance of operator of type book, and we return false. If it's not an instance of type book, it's an instance of any other class, we don't need to go further. This one will also return, or will also return false if this one is null. So we don't need to explicitly check for null, since the instance of operator will already do that for us. So the next thing is we cast our object to a book. By now we know it is a book, so we can safely cast it here. And now we have this book and we have the other book, and we want to compare the two books. So what I'll do here is I compare properties that I want to compare, and whenever they are different, I return false. So at the end, I know I checked all my properties and I can return true. So first thing is I compare this dot author is not equal to dot author. Oh, other dot author. I return false. Now, ideally, I shouldn't use the not equal here since it's a string. So we should be, whenever it's an object, we should use the equals method. So I change this to equals. Now there's still one problem here. This author could be null. In that case, I would get the null pointer exception. So what I should really do is check if this one is not null, then I can compare then I can call the equals method. And if it's null, I want to check that other dot author is also null. So I can do this by using the equals method of the objects plural class. So objects.equal, this one expects two arguments. So I pass in this dot author and other dot author. So essentially it calls the equals method on both objects and compares both objects. But if they are null, it handles null checks as well. And then I say if they are not equal, I return false. And then I do the same with the title. Equals, and I pass in this dot title and other dot title. And then I return false. Now, I don't want to blindly compare all the properties because I really just want to use the identifying properties. If the price changes of my book, but the title and the author is still the same, it's probably still the same book. I may have somehow created another object, or if I have a client-server application where the client sends an object and that gets marshaled, and on the server it gets unmarshaled. I have that object, I have it maybe somewhere else in my application. I really want to be sure that I can compare objects, even if some of the properties changes that are not identifying the object directly. So here I just use author and title. And then after I compared all, I return true. So let's walk through this one more time. the equals method gets an object that can be really any object of any class in Java. We first check the reference. If it points to the exact same memory address, it is definitely the same object. So we return true. Next, we check, is this object that is passed to this equals method actually an instance of type book? If it's not a book, we don't need to compare further. It cannot be the same. And if it's null, it will also return false here. So next, we know it is a book, so we cast to another book object. We call this other. And then we compare the properties, author to author. If they are not the same, we return false. And we do the same for title. If the titles are not the same, we return false. Now, if we are still in our method here, we know everything was the same. It was a book, authors were the same, and titles were the same. So this is for the equals method. If we go back to our main and we run our program, now we get true. So the comparison now is really based on our values, not on the reference. Now let's take another look, or let's expand this to hash map or set. So let's say we have a hash set of type books. And now for the set, we also call the contains method, and we run this. This is false. Why is this false? So we already overrode the equals method, but hash set and hash table, they both require us to also implement the hashCode method. So let's go back to our book class and let's overwrite the hashCode method here. So public int hashCode, and add the overwrite annotation. And the way to implement this is we create a variable called result. And then for each identifying property, we use that identifying property in our hashCode and we update our result. So we do result equals some prime number, typically it's 31, multiplied by our result, our existing result, and then we add the identifying property. So here author, if author is null, we use 0, otherwise we call the hash function on it. So this is really just a pattern. I don't want to go into too much detail, but we use a prime number here. Typically it's 31 because prime numbers result in less collisions in our hash table. And we use the existing result. So we start with 1, we use 1 times the prime number, typically 31, and then we add another hashCode to the result. So if our property is null, we just add 0, we don't add anything to it. But if it's not null, we just call the hashCode function on it. And we do the same here with any other property. In this case, we also have title. So again, we do 31 multiplied by our existing result plus title. And if title is null, we just add 0, so we don't add anything. Otherwise, we call the hashCode function on title. Now, if we were to add the price, which we don't want to do because it's not an identifying property, but we could do it the same way, 31 times result plus we could just do price. But for any object, we really want to call the hashCode function on the object. So like I said, in this case, these two properties, author and title, are sufficient to identify an object. And then here we just return the result. So this one is really just a pattern that you can use in any class. If we now go back to our main and we run this code again. Well, actually, what I forgot earlier, set.add, I want to add the first book. And let's execute this. This one gives us true. So let's go back here. Let's see if I don't have this method. I comment it out and I go back here and run it. It will give me false. So definitely we need the hashCode function. And for a hash map, we actually need both. We need a hashCode and we need the equals method. So the hashCode is first used to map to an index, and then if there are multiple objects stored on an index or at that index, we use the equals method to compare to which particular object we are looking for. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned how to override the hashCode and the equals method. And you definitely want to always override both. You don't want to just override because you think you only use it in list. Always override both. Thank you for watching.